Mekhi Becton still out here just catching strays from random NFL insiders. Robert Saleh speaks up about Alijah Vera-Tucker and the possibility of him playing tackle this season. And a question the Jets are going to have to ask themselves come time to cut down to 53. I'm Glenn Naughton with JetNation.com. Be sure to log into JetNation.com where you can register and become a part of what is the most active Jets message board on the web. So Mekhi Becton, this is just a never-ending thing. As I've said a million times before, I understand there are reasons to question what's going on with Becton, to be concerned about his health, to worry about whether or not he'll be the same player. I get all that. However, I've always been in the camp of elite talent, caught some bad breaks, maybe didn't make the best decision in coming back from those, but young guy, had a kid, maybe the lights come on, he's dropped the weight, he's putting in all the work. But even still, and he played the other night against Cleveland. I get it. He only played 7 snaps. As myself and anyone would tell you, that was alarming in of itself. To be slated to play 25 snaps, pulls himself out after 7, that's a little bit scary. But for the 7 snaps he played, again, acknowledging, very small sample size, he looked damn good. Like, Mekhi Becton looked like a really good player. And he always has when he's on the field. This isn't to say he's been perfect, but for when he's been asked to play, Mekhi Becton's done some very impressive things. So he's dropped all this weight, recommitted himself, and NFL insider Jason La Canfora did an interview the other day where he came out and said something you're not going to hear get talked about on Hard Knocks is that Mekhi Becton is still a stiff. I mean, a stiff? Listen, maybe this is just a matter of, how we define some of these words. But to me, a stiff is a guy who doesn't belong on the field. Is a guy who, no disrespect, but we're talking Wayne Hunter. Like a guy who just gets beat on every single rep. Now, you can talk to me about how Mekhi Becton has struggled with some of these speed guys. We've heard he's had a hard time handling Lawson going back to last year. We've heard McDonald's beat him up a little bit. Fine. If you want to say some of these guys with that elite, high-level, quick twitch on the outside are giving him a hard time, okay, that's fine. But there's a reason why Will McDonald gets drafted where he does and why Carl Lawson gets paid why he does. They give guys a hard time. But Mekhi Becton in game against Cleveland looked absolutely fine. He looked really good, if we're being honest. So to me, if you're telling me that a guy looks like a stiff, I don't expect him to be able to block anybody come game time. Now, Becton obviously has durability questions to answer, and that's why this Saturday's game is huge for Mekhi Becton. The Jets, that coaching staff, they need to see this guy go out there and play 25, 30, 35 snaps and build himself up in the coming weeks to being able to play a full game. Because Mekhi Becton, whether you like him or not, whether you want him on this team or not, is absolutely one of the best players on this team when he's healthy, which is, again, has not been frequent enough. Nobody would disagree with that. But right now, if the Jets are putting together an offensive line where, if you saw the other day, Aaron Rodgers wasn't so thrilled. The O-line got beat up pretty good against Carolina. There's a lot of swapping and rotating with the tackles every day. But they need to start putting this thing together and get some continuity on this line as the season approaches. There's still time. Still a month away. But, as Robert Saleh addressed today, he was asked by one of the beat guys, and this is something a lot of people mentioned in the offseason. We covered it a lot on our show. Alijah Vera-Tucker. Is Alijah Vera-Tucker going to play tackle? Is he one of the best tackles on this roster? Whether the Jets prefer him at guard is beside the point. What the Jets should be doing is putting the best 5 guys out there. And assuming, yes, it's a big assumption, but this is how you move forward as you prepare for a season. You look at your roster, you expect the guys who are healthy to remain healthy, and you adjust as you go if they get injured. Right now, with everyone healthy, especially, again, Mekhi Becton, he's got to show that endurance. He's got to show that he can play enough snaps to get a full game in. But if he gets himself to that point and he still remains healthy, Mekhi Becton is not just a top 5 offensive lineman on this team. He's a top 1 or 2. You want to say AVT's better? Fine. But there's not a number 3 who comes close to what AVT and Becton can. And I would argue Becton on his best day is the number 1 on this O-line. It's just he hasn't been able to stay on the field. But if he can, and you're playing your best five. To me, that question for Saleh today about AVT, that AVT at tackle is probably what's best for this team. If we're going top five, because Joe Tippmann, rookie or not, highly skilled guy. I thought number one center in this draft. And we've been hearing for weeks now that he's always working with the threes, and some people are overreacting far too much to that. Oh, he's with the threes. He must be lost. He must not know the offense. He's got to be. He's not playable right now. He's a project. All of a sudden, he gets on the field, plays more snaps than anybody else the other day against Cleveland, and looked phenomenal. Looked phenomenal. And that was his first action. So you would expect him to get better, to show improvement. So there's a really good chance he's a top five guy when all is said and done. So if you've got Tippmann and you've got Becton and you've got AVT, that just leaves your guards. We're going to assume, we don't know at this point, we got to see him live, but we're going to assume, based on his history, Laken Tomlinson is in that top five. If he plays like he did early last year, he's not. He's not a top five. But let's say he bounces back, right? That's the hope, the expectation. If he doesn't, then you go from there. You look at a Wes Schweitzer. You look at what you can do to flip guys around. But as of now, don't forget, Connor McGovern started his career as a right guard. And Joe Tippmann played. I've seen people talk about Tippmann. Oh, Tippmann played guard in college. No, he didn't. Tippmann had a handful of practices in college. He didn't play any live games at guard while he was at Wisconsin. So I would expect Tippmann at center, Becton and AVT at the tackles. And I shouldn't say expect. I'm not predicting what will happen. I'm just saying what I think would be in the best interest of this team right now. And I was encouraged by the fact that Robert Saleh, while addressing it, said, AVT at tackle hasn't been ruled out. Because if we're talking best five, it's Becton, AVT, Tomlinson, McGovern at right guard, and then Tippmann at center. Now, people have talked about, will Rodgers prefer the veteran at center? That's a possibility. That's a whole other obstacle. We don't know that. If Tippmann plays well and doesn't have any issues at center, then I don't see why Rodgers would have issues with him being at center. But again, I completely understand that veteran players often want to be on the field with those veteran players. They don't want to be with kids who are going to make the rookie mistakes. Totally makes sense. So anything's possible there, with McGovern. But if we're just talking about the best five guys, AVT and Becton are your two best linemen. And they can plug in at your tackles. And then Dwayne Brown, that leaves a big question. I've said all offseason that Dwayne Brown is starting at left tackle, that Mekhi Becton is not taking that job. But if the tackles are struggling as much as they are, Max Mitchell didn't look phenomenal the other day against the Browns. And the tweets from practice the other day against Carolina said he was struggling mightily. Getting beat up pretty good when the Jets went live. They had a 3 and out on what was supposed to be a 2-minute drill. Offensive line was getting beat up. So there's some questions to be answered, but the key here is Saleh's willingness already to say, AVT at tackle might be a thing. That might happen. So where he ends up, we'll see. But when it comes to the 53-man roster, one guy who's fighting his way onto the roster and really does sort of throw a wrench into all of this, all of these projections, all of these 53-man roster projections. I did one. I've seen a couple. But a guy who, probably, honestly, as the season gets closer, will probably do another 53-man roster projection. But Nick Bawden, the fullback, who, when we did a live show a couple of weeks ago, somebody asked me, what about keeping Bawden on the roster as a runner, a downhill runner? I said there's no way they're going to run him because that's not what this offense is going to be about. I said he thought he was a good fullback, but he wouldn't make this roster. There's simply too much talent and not enough room. You're looking at this receiver room and thinking, how do you keep 6? You might want to keep 7, but you're going to have a hard time keeping 6. The tight ends, what are you going to do there? You got 4 guys who can play. What about Kenny Yeboah? We know about the starters, the presumed starters. We know about Jeremy Ruckert coming on and looking like he's going to take the starting job at some point. So you got Conklin, you got Uzama, you got Ruckert. Kenny Yeboah, again, he's no slouch. And then you got Zach Kuntz, who the other day, and I had a little back and forth earlier today on Twitter about this. The second watch, when I rewatched that Cleveland game, that was one of the things that jumped out at me. I was like, Kuntz was, listen, I'm not here saying he was George Kittle out there blocking, but he was a much better blocker than I expected to see early on. I thought he was going to be a guy just getting run over by guys who, him as a tight end coming from a small school where he wasn't asked to block a whole lot. I thought preseason backups, whatever, the the 88th guy on the Browns roster is a lot better than 99% of the guys Coons has ever blocked. So I really thought if they use him in this role as a blocker, we're going to see Coons get run over. That didn't happen. He looked okay. So right away you're thinking, is there more to work with here as a blocker than we anticipated? And that puts a fourth tight end in the mix. And as I mentioned the other day, you look historically at NFL teams, I understand anything can happen. You do see guys get cut, but for the most part, GMs keep their draft picks. It is really rare that draft picks don't make a roster. So Kuntz, if you want to say he lands in that 10-15% of guys who don't make a roster, okay, fine. Let's play that game. Let's say Kuntz doesn't make the roster, which I'm not prepared to say that. But even if you just concede that for the sake for the sake of this argument, then that still leaves you with Uzama, with Conklin, with Ruckert, and again Yeboah. I mean, he looks like the odd man out, but at this point, you can make an argument that he's as good as Coons. He may not have the same ceiling, and he's not the shiny new toy. He's not the draft pick, so maybe he does go. But you've got four tight ends that you would probably like to keep, and even if you take Yeboah out of the equation. And then at receiver, we've talked about the numbers there. We've talked about the fact that you're going to keep Randall Cobb. He's making $3 million. He's one of Aaron Rodgers' best friends, so he's staying. You know you're keeping Lazard. Obviously, he's a newcomer. He's got history. Garrett's not going anywhere, and you've got Corey Davis, who might be the odd man out with only 1 year left on his deal. But then you've got Jason Brownlee playing well. You've got Xavier Gipson flashing, and you need a return man. And I understand there's other candidates in that role, but there's a lot of guys that take the time to sit down, if you're that into this stuff, and try to do a 53-man roster and include Nick Bawden. And the reason I say that is because we just keep hearing day after day, week after week, he's heavily involved in practice. The first couple of days of practice, you're like, wait a minute. We're hearing this guy's name a lot, but are they going to carry a fullback? Because your teams don't do it as much nowadays. And it hasn't gone away. We hear, I mean, in recent days, maybe not as much, but everyone who's out at camp watching these practices is coming away saying, this guy looks like he's going to be a part of the offense. So you add Bawden, that means you're going to have to pull a receiver that you thought was going to make it, or a tight end who you thought was going to make it. And if you're keeping Kuntz and you're keeping Ruckert, like how many teams keep four tight ends and a fullback? And what that's going to mean for the Jets, and I've said this, a couple of times recently, I think we're going to see a deal or two. I think as the season gets closer, somebody like Corey Davis or somebody. Now, Uzama, I believe he reworked his deal. I don't know what the cap hit would be. I'd have to look at that. I don't know how movable he is, and he's such a likable guy. You want to see Uzama hang around, like locker room guy. But that's not going to be enough to save him if they're trying to keep Kuntz, if Ruckert keeps doing what he's doing and progressing and, moving in the right direction. It's going to make life tough. It's going to make some tough decisions for Joe Douglas and his coaching staff, Robert Saleh, as they move forward. But it's a nice problem to have, right? I mean, it looks as if the Jets have some very, legitimately talented players on this roster. Whether it's the receivers, where you'd love to keep 6 or 7, or where there's the tight ends, and they're doing well enough that you want to keep them. I didn't even mention E.J. Jenkins yet. Project guy, probably goes to the practice squad, but looked solid in his debut. But listen, they got names and bodies, and you add a fullback to that mix, and you got to start searching to find another guy to let go. It's quite the little, and this guy right here, Chaz Surratt, right? Check it out, front page of JetNation.com. Just did a story on him. He's a guy that I mentioned. Really, I mean, I was kind of on that bandwagon when they signed him after the Vikings let him go last year, and kind of followed him. Hoped he would get some game action. They activated him. He got dinged up, hamstring, same as the other day. He's got to stay on the field. But the linebackers, how many do they keep? They're keeping Zaire Barnes. He's a pick. Obviously keeping C.J. Mosley. Obviously keeping, Quincy Williams. So a lot of guys there. But if you want to keep it, Sherwood's not going anywhere. Are you going to keep another guy in Surratt, especially if he plays as well as you did the other day? A lot of questions to answer come 53 time. Again, as usual, there will be some moves. There will be some surprise cuts. There will be players let go by other teams that you want to grab. So it'll be a hectic couple of days for the Jets once it's time to cut down and make moves. But lots of decisions to come. Some on the field in terms of, AVT, where he lines up. Does Becton start? Where does he start? And then, of course, the 53 cut down and who do you keep and who goes. We'll get some answers to that, hopefully, or at least some clues to how that will play out this Saturday when the Jets take on the Carolina Panthers in Carolina. There will be no Aaron Rodgers. Zach's going to go. And Zach, I'll tell you what, Strevler's gone. I would expect he's got to get 20 pass attempts. Get him 20. Should have got him 20 last week. He got 5. They got to do better than that. 5 pass attempts is not going to cut it. Let's get Zach 20, 25 pass attempts. Just drop back and throw the football. Let's see what he can do. And then, Boyle will come on in relief of him. And the Jets will go from there. We will go from here. And we will catch you next time, Jets fans. Have a good one.